Hello and welcome to another episode of Team Blush. This is part 13 in the KA24E Turbo series. It has been 12 parts and it is now finally time, as you can see on the right side of the screen. We've got some engine break-in oil and it is finally time to go ahead and crank the engine over in this episode. We are super excited and we are even admittedly super nervous to see if things are going to go according to plan when cranking the engine over. But before we do that, we do have a few more things that we need to go ahead and tidy up. We need to go ahead and install a boost controller in the engine bay and get all of that vacuum line routed. We have to install a GM intake air sensor into our new intercooler piping. And we also have to go ahead and install this really nice radium catch can for the increased crankcase pressure that we're going to see from our turbo engine. As well, there are a few other little odds and ends like some spark plug wires, some spark plug wire boots to keep them from melting. We also have to relocate our ignition coil because our turbo was causing clearance issues with that, so we have to move that somewhere else in the engine bay. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into it, and we hope you enjoy finally seeing the fruits of our efforts. Let's begin by finding a location to mount our ignition coil. We need to tackle this first because a short length up the wiring harness, we're going to be splicing in our air intake temperature sensor. For that, we want to get a good idea how long we need to cut the wires to reach our intercooler piping, so laying things out prior is really going to help with that. This is not our final mounting solution for this ignition coil. Ideally in the future this will have a nice riv nut insert to thread into in this location, or we may just honestly convert to a distributorless ignition for a cleaner bay. With the location of our ignition coil mocked up, we can look at cutting the harness to splice in our air intake temperature sensor. This sensor can be wired up in two different places on the wiring harness, either through the MAF sensor or through the original IAT sensor wiring. We decided to connect ours to the original IAT sensor wiring since that makes the most sense for our application, and it's just going to end up in the cleanest final results. DIY AutoTune sells a GM IAT sensor kit on their website that comes with an aluminum threaded bung that we already had welded onto our intercooler piping, the GM sensor itself, a weather pack style connector, the associated pins for that connector, and extra wire to patch your harness. The intake air temperature sensor has no polarity, so it doesn't matter which way you wire it to your existing harness wiring, and it makes this process even easier than it already is. Start by cutting off your OEM IAT plug, strip back the two wires, and take your extra wiring that you got in your DIY AutoTune kit and run it to the location where you plan to install your new GM IAT. After you've figured out the length of wire that you need and have spliced it into the original harness, you can go ahead and terminate the end with your nice new WeatherPack plug. Be sure when assembling this plug that you first slip on the little green rubber weatherproofing grommet. We kind of absent-mindedly messed this up before filming and had to cut our wiring back for a second attempt. You may want to leave some extra length on your wires just in case you make this mistake yourself. The wires will then feed through the body of the plug where you can go ahead and crimp on the pins that were supplied with your kit. These pins have a keyed design so that when you crimp them on and then pull the wires back through the plug, they will actually index with the plastic body and lock in properly. To finish things off, just push in your little rubber grommet in the back to weatherproof it properly, and then go ahead and plug in your sensor. With our IAT sensor finished up, we can go ahead and look at getting our boost solenoid mounted and wired up. Our engine bay is pretty quickly getting crowded with sensors and other accessories, so we decided that this spot seemed like the best place to go ahead and mount it. It also helped that behind this small plug right here on the strut tower hid a threaded hole, and that made a perfect spot to make up a little plate to bolt on our boost solenoid. The The small white pads on our professionally fabricated bracket are just a piece of foam-like isolators. Our idea for those was to keep vibrations down on our boost solenoid. Not really sure how this is going to work in the long term, but we figured we'd give it a try. Because we didn't want our boost solenoid hardwired directly through the firewall, we decided to terminate it with a weather pack plug much similar to our IAT sensor. This will just make things so much easier if we decide to move it in the future or even take it out of the car. Just like the IAT sensor as well, the boost solenoid has no polarity and requires absolutely no thought to wire it in. Just splice it in and feed wiring from the IAT sensor through the firewall. One of the wires requires a 12-volt source. The other wire will be going to our Megasquirt ECU, where we will pin it in just like we did with our gauges in the last video. Since our boost solenoid wiring conveniently ran alongside our gauge wiring, we decided to just go ahead and wire our 12-volt supply wire to the same fuse tap that runs our gauges. The other wire was then run over to where our Megasquirt ECU accessory plug was located, and this wire was pinned to number 7 on the plug. That pretty much sums up the pretty simple wiring for the boost control solenoid, and now we can move on to plumbing its vacuum lines from the wastegate and the turbo compressor housing. Because of where these vacuum lines needed to be routed underneath the manifold, it really wasn't feasible to capture the footage for this. Here is a diagram on exactly how we ran these hoses. The only modifications that we made to this diagram were an extra T, and that was just for our boost gauge sensor, which we denoted in red. This type of boost control solenoid setup will actually allow us to hold our wastegate closed if we decide that we want to command more than the spring wastegate boost pressure of 5 psi. We'll leave a link down in the description below for a great video on explaining boost control solenoid arrangements. We definitely suggest you watch it if you don't know much about this technology. It really helped us with our understanding of how to run this thing. As nice as our Radium Engineering oil catch can is, the installation of it really isn't the most exciting thing in the world. Like we said, we were quickly running out of room in the engine bay, so this is the best spot that we could find for it at the time being. From factory, there's a little clamp on the side of the strut tower, and that holds on to the fuel filter on the S13. We opted just to push the fuel filter to the side for now. It's held in mostly by its fuel lines anyways, and instead we use that clamp for our catch can. The oil catch can was our final big aftermarket component. The only thing we have left to do now is start getting ready for our first engine start, and that starts with getting our cooling system back in order. That's getting our radiator installed with its associating hoses, wire up our fans, and start letting our radiator fill up with coolant while we're working on a few other things. Since we're running a turbocharger now, we'll be switching to some colder spark plugs. A plug that we have been highly recommended is this NGK BKR7E, and we've got these gapped down to a 0.028. Along with our new plugs, we also figured we'd throw on a new set of NGK spark plug wires, and these are helpfully labeled so you know which wire length goes to which cylinder. From what we've seen pretty frequently when people go ahead and turbocharge these engines is that people tend to melt their spark plug wires, so we went ahead and we also picked up some heat insulators for these new NGK spark plug wires. We did drain our transmission fluid when we pulled it from the car originally, so that needed to get filled back up. Be sure that you have your drive shaft on or have at least plugged the rear of the transmission before you go ahead and fill it with fluid. It's not very fun to dump $40 worth of transmission fluid straight onto the ground, and we figured that out for ourselves firsthand. The last fluid we need to pour is our engine oil. We decided to pre-fill our oil filter with some oil to reduce the amount of time our fresh components would be without oil when we're trying to build oil pressure, and then we poured in the rest of the 5 quarts normally. Keep in mind that if you're turbocharging an engine, you'll want to run about half to a full quart more oil than you would normally in a stock engine, and that's in order to make up for the oil that's going to be running through your oil filter sandwich plate, your turbo oil inlet line, and your oil drain. Theoretically, there is one more thing that we need to do before going ahead and trying to turn the engine over, and that is to prime our turbo. We'll show you how to do that here in just a second. But before that, we want to say that before you go ahead and try to start your investment of a new motor, it's a great idea to have some fire extinguishers on hand. You don't want to have spent all this money only for it to literally go up in smoke. We actually know someone whose project car did go up in flames, and you can't even imagine it until it happens to you. So make sure it doesn't happen to you. Get some quality fire extinguishers before you go and turn your engine over. Without further ado, let's go ahead and prime the turbo on the engine, get ready to start it, and we'll see you on the other side. The efficacy of priming a turbo is a bit of a debated topic, but the idea is that you want to turn the engine over on only the starter in order to build oil pressure in the engine and push oil through the oil lines to start lubricating the turbo. Some people will even go to the trouble of holding their turbo from spinning while building that oil pressure, but that is something that we did not really care to do. We pulled the fuel pump fuse out of the fuse box, undid the line for our turbo oil inlet, and then situated it inside of a cut up bottle so we could see if oil begins flowing through it while cranking the engine. And this is the moment when everything went wrong. Okay, so as you've seen in the last footage, things have not gone according to plan. We're having issues with the starter. It seems to be turning the engine over with no spark plugs installed, and the engine is building oil pressure. But when we go to install our spark plugs and raise the compression of the engine, the starter is just not wanting to turn the engine over. We have some theories as to what may be going on, but we don't want to say anything at the moment because we're honestly not 100% sure. As well as the issues that we're having with the starter, this engine is leaking everywhere. We must not have used enough sealant on the timing cover because there's just tons of coolant leaking from there. There is coolant leaking from freeze plugs, and there is even oil leaking from that no-weld oil drain bung that we installed for our turbo drain. So unfortunately, it looks like we're going to go ahead and pull this motor once again. Luckily, all of the stuff that we needed to do to get this engine and this platform ready to be turboed is already done. So it shouldn't be that hard of a process to take this out, piece it out, figure out what's going wrong with it, and then put it back in. We're going to skip recording that. You've seen exactly the steps that you need to take to get an engine and platform like this to the point where it is ready to turn over. We will relay here in just a little bit what the mistake was on our end that is causing our issues. And this is what is going to have been the huge delay in getting this video out to all of you. So we do apologize for that. Things just seem to not work out sometimes. We thought this was going to go a lot smoother than it is turning out, but you know what? It's a learning process, and I think we're just going to get to work. We're going to get this out, and we're going to figure out what we did. We'll see you here in just a little bit where we'll give you the rundown on just what happened. Things have taken a turn for the worse. Unfortunately, when we pulled the engine and were draining the fluids, we found in our break-in oil a lot of metal shavings. So we've been pulling caps, we've been pulling main bearing caps, and we've been pulling rod caps to see if any of the bearings were scored. Unfortunately, we did find that one of the bearings does have a pretty deep gouge in it. It really doesn't look like a deep gouge, but it's enough to grab with a fingernail when running across it. So we're not really sure why that happened, but it is definitely there and it is definitely an issue. From what we're aware, it is pretty common to see a very light dusting of metallic after you've gone ahead and broken in a new engine and drained the fluids. But we haven't even gotten this thing fired up and we're already starting to see some pretty large metal shavings. So unfortunately, we've been thinking about this for the last week or so. We're going to go ahead and pull this entire engine apart. We're going to go and get it line honed. Originally, when getting this block machine for our new pistons, we did not get it line honed, attempting to save a little bit of money. We assumed that when we went ahead and plastic gauged this crank and the bearings that it was fine and in spec, but it unfortunately doesn't seem like that is the case. And unfortunately, we've ran into a situation where we've run out of money for this build. About halfway through this build series, we got laid off from where we were working and we were just trying to make it work as best as we could. We thought we were in the clear. We thought we did everything by the books, but it just doesn't seem like this time it worked out. On another note, we don't think that the metal shavings that we found in the oil have anything to do with the issue that we were having with the starter. We'll show you why we think that here in just a second. This is the reason that we think we might have been having issues with the starter. Through the grapevine, we have heard that a D21 starter and a D21 block should be compatible with an S13 flywheel, which this is. But at the same time, the marks on this flywheel are really suspicious and really make us think that for whatever reason, maybe it's this specific flywheel, but we do not think that this is compatible with our current setup. We'll come in close for you to see. So as you can see on our flywheel here, we're not sure if these marks and gouging were here prior to us trying to start the engine over, but you can definitely see there are some pretty massive chunks taken out of this flywheel. And it would make sense because we heard it sounded like the starter was almost coming off of the flywheel while spinning. It would make sense that those marks would correlate to that sound that we were hearing. Now, unfortunately, we really can't test to see the engagement of the starter on the flywheel because with a D21 starter, it bolts directly to the transmission bell housing and completely shrouds any way to actually visually confirm engagement with the flywheel. So as much as we'd like to confirm that that was the issue when we were trying to turn over our motor, we really can't confirm it 100% except for those markings that we've seen on this flywheel. So all in all, this situation really sucks in more than one way. Honestly, of course, it sucks. We've spent a lot of time and effort and money into getting this engine built, but also at the same time, we've just done this entire YouTube series on how to build a KA24ET engine so that you can go ahead and turbocharge it. And then we went ahead and we ended up building a non-functional engine. It really doesn't lead to much confidence in the information that we've given in the series, as much as we've tried to be 100% transparent and do everything mostly by the book. All of the rambling aside, like we said, we just do not have the funds to attempt a second go at this engine at the moment. and we hope that you understand our decision that we are going to make on this. That is that we are going to put the old engine back in the car. This is a completely stock KA24E from an S13. It's an S13 block. It has an OEM head gasket. It has OEM head studs. These are only known for taking about 10 psi before things start to go wrong in them. And it's really just not going to be as capable as this motor was going to be. That being said, when we were going to start this engine over, we had planned on only running this engine at 5 psi while we learn how to tune on Megasquirt, because we are going to be attempting to tune our engines ourselves. We wanted to keep our boost numbers low. So as much as it does suck that we're not going to have all of these fancy fully forged internals, it is going to be pretty much the same thing that we were going to have with this engine. During the time that we spend driving around on this engine and learning how to tune on Megasquirt, we'll be saving up money to do a second try at getting this engine built. And by that time, we hope that we'll have learned Megasquirt and tuning to a point that we can really put to use the forged internals that we have in this engine. Like we've said, this really sucks. We didn't want this series to end up in this situation, but with how things are going right now and our lack of funds, it really just makes sense to go ahead and put this engine back in the car. So off camera, we have the car completely scattered across the garage right now. We're going to go ahead and transfer the parts that we need from this engine back onto our old engine. So with a quick jump cut here, we're going to get back to priming the turbo. Instead, this time it's going to be on our old engine. Don't worry, this engine is not going anywhere. We just need the time and we need the money to get this done right so that we can show it off in a future episode on the channel. We've got a lot of work to do, so just sit back, relax, we'll get all this done, and we'll see you in just a second. Here we are a few days later. As you can see, we've gotten the old engine back in the car. It looks very similar how it did when we last left you off, but we're gonna go ahead and continue where we left off. We have our turbo oil inlet line right here, and we have a plastic cup. We're just gonna go ahead and turn the engine over after having pulled the fuel pump fuse. We just wanna make sure that the oil pressure is building in this engine. Even though it was running completely fine prior to us pulling it, we just want to double check before we go ahead and get everything running again. We're also doing this to prime the turbo. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to pull you in close so you can hopefully see this cup filling up with oil. Then we can put that fuel pump fuse back in the car and attempt to start it for the first time. Okay, well, the turbo is primed with oil as we've seen. We went ahead and input our base map into our Megasquirt software, and we've just generally looked over things to make sure it seems like it's ready to go. We don't have our cooling system installed right now. We just didn't want to mess with that just in case something does go wrong again. We don't want to have to go and drain all that coolant again and take everything out. So let's go for a take two and see if we can get this engine to fire over. It wants to. Oh my goodness, it finally runs. This has been such a long process. This has been such a long project, and I know this is not the engine that we plan to build, but it is finally a turbocharged single cam KA, and this is a pretty big deal for us. Just alone, the knowledge base that we have gotten while working on this project completely opens up new doors for us. And even though this is a small victory for a lot of people, this is really huge for us. From here, we still need to get our cooling system put back together and just kind of button things up. We just wanted to test fire the engine to see if we could at least get it running and make sure that it was running correctly. We also have to go ahead and get our engine time to 15 degrees like you've seen us do on the Mega Squirt installation episode in this series. We're going to be doing a lot of that same stuff to this engine. If you reach this point in the video, thanks a ton for watching. It always helps with our analytics when people watch to the very end. And especially thank you for your support, not only here on the YouTube channel, but over on our Instagram. We have our Instagram on the screen right now where you can go and interact with us. Sending us a private message over there is the best way to get into contact with us. This is not the last episode in the series. We still have to go ahead and do a breakdown of what everything costs to go ahead and get this done. And in the future, like we said, we will be putting a forged engine in this car. It just isn't in the cards for us right now, but it is definitely going to be a feature on the channel in the future. Depending on when you're watching this video, whether it be day or night, we hope that you are in good spirits and good health. We hope to see you in another episode on the channel in the future, and as always, take it easy.